Ben Bernanke is like a ship captain. He has warning signs. He sails the ship. There's a storm coming. He disregards any warning signals. He disregards the storm signals. He sinks the ship. 1,000 passengers drown. He saves the crew in his control tower, 5 officers and himself in a lifeboat. And he gets a medal for bravery for saving 5 people.
So you see
that's Wall Street, the 5 people. The more significant the correction is, the more money they'll throw at the system. So stocks can go up. Actually, the worse the economic conditions are, the more the stocks could go up.
Because the greater the bubble?
Yes. But it will end badly. It will end badly.
Because it's not like, you know, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the US Treasury and everyone weren't issuing debt back then. Of course they were. But compared to these enormous numbers that we're seeing today, it was nothing. We've created this huge bubble in nominally risk-free but actually highly risky securities. And not only are these securities risky for investors who buy them, they're also, and this is much more important, they're risky for the entire system. They're risky for the global economy because the safer that an instrument is perceived to be, the more systemic damage it does when it blows up. So if you have a dot-com bubble in 2000 when a whole bunch of high-flying internet stocks crashed, that's okay. We can survive that because we knew that was risky and we only really invested risk capital in those stocks. But when something like this blows up, all of these instruments here, that's much more dangerous because that's where people put the money they could not afford to lose.
Here's where we were in September last year. But then the Treasury decided we need to start printing more money. This hockey stick should take your breath away. This is devaluing our money. You know, Al Gore said global warming is not a political issue, it's a moral one. Thomas Jefferson said doing this to our children is immoral. And I agree with him. We have pumped all of this money in and devalued our money. How is it not going to be worthless? This has never, ever been done by anybody ever before.
I'm a trader. I don't really care about that kind of stuff. I go with what if I see an opportunity to make money, I go with that. So for most traders, it's not about we don't really care that much how they're going to fix the economy, how they're going to fix the whole situation. Our job is to make money from it.
Bond yields in Portugal rose to nearly 7% yesterday. The public right across the Union no longer support the currency, and the battle for Spain hasn't even begun. The model itself is failing, and yet what you want is to double the size of the bailout fund. You even want to increase the scope of the bailout fund so that along with the ECB, you too can go on buying yet more of your own debt. You're using the crisis as a massive power grab to take us towards fiscal union.
Spain's getting closer to the point where it can no longer afford to maintain its debt and will need a bailout. The yield, that's the interest rate payable on the country's bonds redeemable in 10 years, has spiked close to 5.7%. Just over 1 month ago, that rate was down below 4.9%. Trying to reassure investors, Spain's economy minister says the deficit targets for this year and next are set in stone.
This economic crisis is like a cancer. If you just wait and wait thinking this is going to go away, just like a cancer, it's going to grow and it's going to be too late. What I would say to everybody is get prepared.
Your top priority to sell is that shitty deal.
Mr.
Got it?
My comment was I didn't recall the sales.
You got it?
That we were
160.
trying to sell.
Okay, you're trying to sell a shitty deal, and it's your top priority. Come on, Mr. Sparks.
Well, Mr.
Should
Chairman,
Goldman Sachs be trying to sell, and by the way, it sold it, a lot of it after that date. Should Goldman Sachs, Be trying to sell a shitty deal.
Well,
Can you answer
again, I
that
didn't
one?
use those
Can you
words,
answer
but-
that one, yes or no?
I don't think that you should be fired. I thought you should have never been hired. And I objected when the hearings were going on over the Senate. I thought there were too many question marks about things that had occurred in the past. And it did not leave the American people with a good feeling about the person who was going to be responsible for this economic recovery.
You know, I remember being here 10 years ago and hearing the launch of the Lisbon Agenda. We were told that with the euro by 2010 we would have full employment and indeed that Europe would be the competitive and dynamic powerhouse of the world. By any objective criteria, the euro has failed and in fact there is a looming impending disaster. You know, this deal makes things worse, not better. 100 billion is put up for the Spanish banking system and 20% of that money has to come from Italy. And under the deal, the Italians have to lend to the Spanish banks at 3%, but to get that money, they have to borrow on the markets at 7%. It's genius, isn't it? It really is brilliant. So what we're doing with this package is we're actually driving countries like Italy towards needing to be bailed out themselves. In addition to that, we put a further 10% on Spanish national debt. And I tell you, any banking analyst will tell you 100 billion doesn't solve the Spanish problem. It would need to be more like 400 billion. And with Greece teetering on the edge of euro withdrawal, the real elephant in the room is that once Greece leaves, the ECB, the European Central Bank, is bust. It's gone. It has 444 billion euros worth of exposure to the bailed out countries. And to rectify that, you'll need to have a cash call from Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Greece and Italy. You couldn't make it up, could you? It is total and utter failure. This ship, the Euro Titanic, has now hit the iceberg and sadly there simply aren't enough lifeboats.
LIBOR, the London interbank offered rate, is the average cost of borrowing as Britain's banks lend each other money. It's calculated daily based on information supplied by those banks. After the financial crisis, the LIBOR rate also was seen as a guide to the health of banks' balance sheets. Barclays' manipulation alone could not have had a big effect on the final rate, but the suggestion is a lot of the big banks were doing the same thing, and the LIBOR rate has an effect on the real economy.
That average is what drives the interest rates paid by hundreds of millions of people on their own mortgages, small businesses on their loans, student loans, insurance products. It affects a hugely diverse range of financial transactions globally, not just in the UK.
Britain's central bank, the Bank of England, is trying to avoid being dragged into this scandal. It's denied it knew about LIBOR manipulation and was allowing it to happen. Barclays says that it submitted artificially low estimates of its borrowing costs because it thought rivals were doing the same, and higher submissions would make it appear to be in trouble.
I can assure you Barclays is not evading taxes.
And if
I can assure you that it is our obligation.
Sorry, that wasn't the question I asked. I said avoidance. I was very careful not to use the word evasion, Mr. Diamond.
Well, I don't know what I think tax evasion is a very clear phrase, and it's a space we would never go to.
And I didn't use the word.
And I chose the word tax efficiency, which is our obligation, and it's something that is in line with government policy.
Your efficiency may be our avoidance.
We have so many economists coming on our air and saying, oh, this is a bubble and it's going to burst and this is going to be a real issue for the economy. Some say it could even cause a recession at some point. What is the worst case scenario if, in fact, we were to see prices come down substantially across the country?
Well, I guess I don't buy your premise. It's a pretty unlikely possibility. We've never had a decline in house prices on a nationwide basis. So what I think is more likely is that house prices will slow, maybe stabilize, might slow consumption spending a bit. I don't think it's going to drive the economy too far from its full employment path, though.
So would you agree with Alan Greenspan's comments recently that we've got some areas of the country that are seeing froth, not necessarily a national situation, but certainly froth in some areas?
You can see some types of speculation, investors turning over condos quickly. So those sorts of things you see in some local areas. I'm hopeful that, and I'm confident, in fact, that the bank regulators will pay close attention to the kinds of loans that are being made, making sure that underwriting is done right. But I do think that this is mostly a localized problem and not something that's going to affect the national economy.
All through the summer of 1929, there had been ominous rumblings. For months, unemployment had been rising. Automobile sales and department store revenues had fallen off sharply. Across the South and West, farms were failing in record numbers. And still on Wall Street, the delirious optimism continued, undimmed. On August 27, 1929, the Dow Jones average reached its all-time peak. As summer turned to fall, the mood changed. As the stock market dipped, then rose, then lurched downwards again, investors grew increasingly uneasy. In September, an economist named Roger Babson sent a wave of fear rippling through Wall Street when he warned that sooner or later, a crash is coming, and it may be terrific. But most experts brushed away any concerns. Stock prices, one man declared, have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. And then the bottom fell out. On Wednesday, October 23rd, 1929, the first waves of panicky selling began to drive down the price of blue-chip stocks, like Westinghouse and General Electric. The following morning, the fear turned to panic, and brokers began unloading margin accounts at record speed. Stock prices plummeted sickeningly across the board, spurring the rush of sell orders from terrified speculators still more. As anguished shrieks rose up from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, the visitors' gallery was cleared. In less than 2 hours, nearly $10 billion invested in stocks was simply wiped out. Outside on the street, crowds massed 6 deep in front of the stock exchange, while hundreds more stood in shocked silence on the steps of Federal Hall. Newspapers would later try to describe the uncanny murmuring sound that echoed off the stone facades of the financial district that morning. It was a collective moan of horror and grief, and stunned disbelief, rising up from thousands of ruined, frightened men.
And we live in a housing complex, no running water, nothing, really poor.
And this was where, in Germany?
In Germany.
Yeah.
And let me tell you something else. When you said, what would you advise?
Yeah.
Money is useless. Gold and silver, hard assets, bring you to the war on the feet. And let me tell you, I remember I was 8 years old and we had nothing. We had to jump on a moving train, to some little village, begging for food, right? We went, my sister and I, we were not the only one begging for food. We went, never forget this, we went into a farmer's house. There was the farmer sitting with his wife. She sat there, and he sat there and said, he came in, 2 girls, 8 or 9 years old, right, begging for food. And they sat there and he said, look, I'm not going to give you anything. And his wife sat next to her and said, please, she said, look at the 2 little girls. They're really hungry. Why can't we give them a little bit,
Yeah.
And you know what they said? Oh, okay, we give them a piece of bread and a little piece of cheese. And we were so happy to get that. begging for food. Now, I want to tell you, in order to get out of the things, because my parents didn't have all that. My father was a hard worker, you know. He was drafted to the war in 1939. My mother had 3 kids, you know, the bombing of Hamburg, you know, flattening of Hamburg, you know. Mm-hmm. When I lived in this little housing complex with nothing, I mean, we have nothing. There was a family. She had 3 children, a boy and 2 girls. And her husband was in the war too, but he had a pharmacy before. So he came out of the war. Within 1 week, all the women were helping each other. This woman didn't know how to do housework. My mother and everybody had to help her. This man came back. Within 1 week, he had a bicycle for his kids. He had a car, and he took his family out of this complex. You know how he got it? He had gold and silver.
That's quite a good thing to learn.
That's what gets you through the war. Money is useless. Gold and silver, you survive on that. And that's the only thing that gets you through it.
True money.
That is an example I had. That man had gold and silver.
And that's how he
And then he
was
went
able
out
to
to the
survive.
farmers. He got food. He got everything. Gold and silver buys you anything. That's what people want. They don't want your money.
You grip my hand, as only children will when too afraid for brazen cockiness. I couldn't prize my fingers free, me twice your size and twice your strength. But you have the power of desperation, and me the weakness of complacency. So I had to look into your eyes, at all that I was afraid to face, of what I would sometimes, in days of weakness, pretend did not exist, and least of all for children. And you, why you were not the slick professional beggar, well versed in teasing out the guilt and soft wishes of the indulgent tourist, salving short-lived consciences. No, you were out of control, dendrite zinging round your head, already lost, turmoil long before the glue had dulled your senses and sent you spinning down the street. A string-pulled puppet, your glazed eyes pleading for something neither you nor I could grasp.